Now, you may not have known this, but rock, paper, scissors actually has a professional league. In fact, in 2002, two brothers, Douglas and Graham Walker, rented out a bar in Toronto and held the first ever world championship for rock, paper, scissors. Now, really, they expected 15 to 20 of their friends to show up, drink some beer, and have fun competing in a rock, paper, scissors tournament, maybe win a prize. But in the end, hundreds of people showed up for this first tournament, to the point that the next year, major news networks actually covered the tournament, including CNN. And then in 2006, Bud Light sponsored the tournament and offered $50,000 to the winner of the World Championship for rock, paper, scissors. Now, you may be surprised to realize that this game isn't just a game of chance, that there's actually some strategy involved. So, for example, one of the strategies that some of the people who compete in this league might use is that when they're discussing when to throw, rock, paper, scissors, shoot, they're going to flash scissors because that primes their opponent to throw scissors on the first throw. Or one of the other things that they have realized is that a lot of beginners to this game will never throw the same thing twice. So if you know that they throw rock, for example, then your next round, you're going to throw scissors because chances of them using rock again are really slim. And so if you use scissors, at the very least you tie if they throw scissors. At best, you win when they throw paper. One person takes a more psychological approach. Brian Bennett has discovered that for a lot of people, their very first throw determines what they win or lose by. So what I mean by that is someone's first throw tends to be their go-to move. So in a situation where they might win or lose, they tend to revert back to the same thing they used the very first time. So he always pays attention and remembers what they used first. So in those win-lose situations, he can predict what they're likely to use in that scenario as well. So there's a lot of strategy involved. Now, the reality is this league is kind of fizzled out. They haven't held a tournament in like 10 years. And yet, rock, paper, scissors continues to be one of the main go-to ways for making a decision. In fact, this league, which doesn't take themselves too seriously, actually put in their rule book in item 6 of the player responsibility code, they say, think twice before using rock, paper, scissors for any life-threatening decisions. And they describe their league as the Wimbledon of lazy, drunk decision-making. And so this has always been this kind of go-to method for making decisions. If two people are trying to decide, who gets to do something, they'll play rock, paper, scissors for it. Well, as we move into Nehemiah chapter 11, the wall has been rebuilt. The people have begun to reform as a community. And so we've seen them reading God's word and repenting and celebrating the festivals that God commanded them to celebrate to begin with. And then in our last video, we looked at this covenant that they made together, a covenant to keep the covenant with God. And now they still need to fill the city. They need people who will move back to the city. And so at the beginning of chapter 11, we see them essentially playing rock, paper, scissors to decide who's going to actually move back to Jerusalem now that the wall is finished. So look at this, Nehemiah 11 verse 1. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in their other towns. Right, so they're throwing lots, they're casting lots. So essentially, they're playing rock, paper, scissors to see who is going to move back to the city. Now, my kids, they play rock, paper, scissors all the time. Sometimes it's to decide who has to do something. Sometimes it's to decide who gets to do something. Like who has to wash the dishes tonight? Rock, paper, scissors for it. Who gets to eat the last cookie? Rock, paper, scissors for it. Well, in this case, for the Israelites, is this a have to or a get to? Look at the next verse. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. And so there's this sense that some people are volunteering to go and live, and people are celebrating that. They're blessing them. They're honoring those who willingly volunteer to go back to Jerusalem, which makes us think that this is really kind of a have to. When they're casting lots to see who moves back, they're casting lots to see who has to move back, or like who draws the short straw. Why is that? I mean, they've just spent all this time rebuilding this wall. Like, all these people rallied together behind this project. They spent all this time rebuilding the wall, go through all this effort. You've got the promises of God all along that when they've been exiled, that God will bring them back and they'll live in the city again. So why now is this a have to? Shouldn't they look at this as like, who gets to move back to Jerusalem? Well, there's a few things going on here. One, and when you've got Jerusalem, is going to be a target for attack. Anytime you've got this walled city, if an invading army comes in, that's going to be their point of attack. They're going to attack the city. That's where the resources are. That's where the army is likely to be. And so they'll attack the city to put yourself into Jerusalem, put yourself in harm's way. It puts a target on your back. The other thing is, think about just in our own world. We tend to move away from the city. We look for space, and we don't want to live. There's an urban sprawl where we're moving away from the city. And so here, people aren't necessarily excited about moving back into this city, giving up their land, their space, and that's an economic decision. Like, these are agrarian people. They're farming the land, they're raising herds and cattle, and so without the land, that takes away their economy. So for some of these people, it's a financial sacrifice to move back to the city. So, and in some cases, they've just grown comfortable where they are. We've looked at this earlier in this study. There were some people in these first waves of people heading back to Jerusalem that didn't go because they had grown comfortable even in the foreign lands where they lived. And so here you've got people who are kind of just playing rock, paper, scissors to see who has to go back to Jerusalem. Now, if that's the case, think about this is a great leadership lesson for us. Who are the first people living in the city? Tells us that now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem. The leaders went first. They are leading by example. And then we see in verse 2 that there are some people who are volunteering to go. They're willingly offering to go. Almost think of it in terms of like the Vietnam draft. Right? So there's this draft, this lottery to see who's going to get picked to fight in the war. You're just kind of hoping that your number doesn't get called. But then there are some who voluntarily enlist to fight so that others do not have to. That's the picture here. This is a kind of a pre-Christ picture of a Christ-like attitude. This is Philippians chapter 2, where you are willingly setting aside your own rights, your own desires for the sake of others, for the benefit of others. What are some ways that you might be called to voluntarily go back to Jerusalem, so to speak? What are some of the places where you can willingly lay aside your rights, where you can set aside your desires for the sake of other people, and maybe do what no one else wants to do? Or on the other side, these people who are willingly doing this, the rest of the people are honoring them, they are blessing them. Who are the people you see who are already doing this, who are doing what nobody else wants to do? And how can you honor and bless them? Think about people like first responders who willingly run in when others are running out, who run into danger while others are fleeing for safety. What are some ways that we can honor our first responders? Or inside the church, you've got people who are serving in ways and in ministries where few people want to serve. How can we honor and bless those people? And how can you begin to do the same, to have this Philippians 2 kind of mindset where you are willingly setting aside your desires and your interests for the sake of other people? Well, we're actually going to see a few things that the people are called to do that sometimes we view as a have to instead of a get to. Or like when we think about this move, this is something they should view as we get to go back to Jerusalem. God has been calling us to this. We get to go back. But for them, it's a have to. What are some of those things that maybe as Christ followers we're called to do that we view as we have to do this kind of thing? when really we should be looking at this as we get to do this. This passage here in Nehemiah 11 and 12 is going to address a few of those, all centered around worship. It's praise, it's serving, and it's giving. Things that sometimes we look at as we have to do this, but really we get to do this. So let's keep going. In verse 3, we begin to get into one of these long lists of names where it's just listing out all these different people. In fact, at the rest of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12, we see over 200 names listed. Well, when we get to these places, we're tempted to just kind of skip over them. But God has recorded these and put these lists in His Word for a reason. Like He thought it was important for us to have this. So why? What are some of the things that we can draw out of these lists? Well, in this list, one of the things that we begin to notice is that everybody has a role. So for example, as you're reading through, you'll notice that there are these valiant men, or the men of valor, in verses 6 and 8 and 14. Presumably, these are the people who are defending the city. And then in verse 12, you see people who worked in the temple and who do the work of the house. Like when it's talking about doing the work of the house, these are the people who are making preparations for worship, and they're serving in the temple. And then in verse 16, you see some people who are over the work outside of the house, outside of the temple. They're maintaining the temple. They're maintaining the grounds. A couple years ago, our family took a vacation down to Nashville, Tennessee, and we were going to visit the Opryland Mills Hotel, just kind of walk around. I mean, this place is beautiful. And so we were just going to walk around and kind of look around in there. And as we were walking towards the hotel, we see one of the staff members of the hotel is outside dusting the handrails and kind of cleaning up outside. And one of my kids just shouts out, "They even dust the outside here." Like, we can't take our kids anywhere. Oh, they're so shocked that they would clean the outside. Well, there are people who their role for Israel is to maintain the grounds, to to oversee the outside work of the house. Then you've got some who are in charge of singing in verses 22 and 23. You've got Pethahiah, who seems to be this sort of ambassador to the king on behalf of the Jewish people. So what we see is this in this list of people is everybody has a role in the community. I mean, this list is representative. It's not exhaustive. So what's your role in the community? When you think about the community of believers that you're a part of, the church you're a part of, what is your role in the community? Because everybody has a role. One of the other things that we see here in this list is a sense of a spiritual heritage. So, for example, look at it just in verse 17. And you know, in these lists, sometimes it's hard to walk through all the names and pronounce the names, but we'll try to struggle through it together. In verse 17, and Mattaniah, the son of Micah, the son of Zabdi, the son of Asaph, who was the leader of the praise, who gave thanks, and Bakbukiah, the second among his brothers, and Abda, the son of Shemua, son of Galal, son of Jeduthun. Right, so list name after name after name. But I always love, as you're reading through a verse, when you see a bunch of names, and then there's like just a break where there's like a phrase that gives us just a little bit more insight into one of the people on the list. Like, for example, here you've got the son of Asaph. Well, Asaph, it describes him as who was the leader of praise, who gave thanks. Right, so if you've been reading through Psalms, you might have noticed this name Asaph attached to a couple of the Psalms. Like, this is likely here in this list the same guy who wrote some of the Psalms. This is one of Israel's best praise and worship leaders. And we see this spiritual heritage of you got this guy who's the son of this guy, who's the son of this guy, and it traces him back to Asaph. We see a spiritual heritage going on here. Why is it so important for them to remember their heritage? Well, we see God working in our life long before we ever come to know Him. What is your spiritual heritage? I think here about Paul and what he says to Timothy of, I see your faith that lived first in your grandmother Lois and then in your mother Eunice and now lives also in you. That there really is a sense of passing on a spiritual heritage. For me, you know, I've got a grandfather who is a pastor in the Methodist Church. I've got on my dad's side of the family devout Catholics. And I think about my grandmother who went to Mass nearly every day after she retired, just a devout Catholic. I see the faith that was in my grandparents and in my parents, and now lives in me, a faith that I've made my own. There's a spiritual heritage there. And you may or may not feel like you have a spiritual heritage, but on the other side of that, how are you leaving a legacy, a spiritual legacy? How are you leaving behind a spiritual heritage? How are you pouring into your children who will invest in your grandchildren, who will invest in your great-grandchildren? What an amazing thing to think that you will have great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who trace their spiritual heritage back to you. But here's the thing, you cannot give your children, you cannot give them something that you don't possess. So, for example, if I want to leave my children after I die, if I want to leave them $1 million, well, I can't leave them $1 million because I don't possess $1 million. You cannot pass on what you do not possess. So for us to pass on a faith to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, we have to possess that faith. We have to be growing in our own relationship with God. What does that spiritual heritage look like in your life? How are you leaving a spiritual heritage for your family and for others? How are you investing in and pouring in other people? That's a great question for us to consider as we think about our own faith journey. Well, as we continue to move through this list, we get into chapter 12 and they begin to establish the priesthood. Now, you've got to remember that at this point, they're basically rebuilding an entire nation. So they're reforming as a nation. And what's the first thing they put into place? It's not a government. It's not an economic system. It's not even a family system. The first thing that they really focus on putting into place is a priesthood. It's to ensure that the people remain committed to God and continue to worship Him. And so the first 26 verses of chapter 12 is all about putting this priesthood in place so that they are a people who are formed and shaped by worship. Think about what David does as he's about to pass on his kingdom to Solomon. When David's getting ready to pass on his kingdom to Solomon, in 1 Chronicles chapter 23 through 26, it spends 4 chapters where David is setting up this priesthood and setting up everything needed for worship to ensure that the people will continue to worship him even after he passes, even after he's no longer their leader. And then in 1 Chronicles 27, we get 1 chapter setting up the military, 1 chapter on defense, 4 chapters on worship. Here we see the very first thing they establish is to create a people who are responsible and in charge of overseeing the worship, because worship is what's most important to those people. They are formed and shaped out of worship. And then in verse 27, chapter 12, verse 27, we begin to see them dedicate the wall, and we see this celebration that takes place. So verse 27, and at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem, to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. So they're dedicating the wall, and there's this huge celebration. It's loud, it's raucous, there's gladness, there's cymbals. I mean, there's just noise and just joy and celebration as they dedicate the wall. As I was reading this, here we are in March Madness, I couldn't help but think about the coach of Miami as they celebrated their win over number 1 Houston to move on to the Sweet 16, and now they're moving into the Final Four. But watch this celebration.
They had a game plan, and it didn't work, and they got beat down. But I actually, oh my goodness.
Work it out, Coach Larranaga. Work it out.
Hey, he's doing it wrong now.
Work it out. Work it out, Coach Larranaga.
Man, please, I can't unsee that.
Oh, he's better than you. He's much better than you.
I can't.
Chuck, I've seen you dance, and I've seen Coach Larranaga dance. Dancing with the Stars.
Well, neither one of us should be
gets
dancing.
a 10. He gets a 9.5. You get like a 7.
Okay, no question.
So they defeat number 1 Houston, and in the locker room there's this huge celebration as they celebrate what they have accomplished. They've celebrated their achievement. Well, now here in Nehemiah chapter 12, we see this big celebration, and it's loud and it's joy and just this huge time of celebrating. Well, what is it they're celebrating? Well, let's keep going. In verse 31, it says, Then I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south of the wall towards the dung gate, and after them went Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah. And it keeps listing another list of names of all the people involved in this sort of parade that's taking place. But it says Nehemiah saying, I brought all these people up onto the wall. Think about where they're standing during this celebration. You got all these people who are standing up on this wall that they've just finished building. This is the same wall that earlier in Nehemiah, Tobiah says about this wall, if a fox jumps on it, this thing's crumbling to the ground. And here they are standing up on this wall, and they are celebrating. And what is it they're celebrating? It's not their accomplishments and their achievements. They're not standing on this wall like, man, look at what we've accomplished. This is awesome. Instead, this is a different kind of celebration. They're not celebrating what they've done. They are celebrating what God has done. Verse 43 kind of summarizes all of this for us. And it says, And they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. 5 times in this one verse, we get this word joy, rejoice. We see this joyful celebration. And what they're celebrating God and what He has done, not their own accomplishments and achievements. But I love the way it's worded here. It says, For God had made them rejoice. And sometimes we look at praise and worship as a have to, but this is really something we get to do. Maybe you don't love to sing and you go to church on Sunday and you're standing there and it's like, oh great, here we go again. We have to sing, we have to praise. This is not a have to, this is a get to. But there are times where, like as a parent, there are times I make my kids do something that I know in the end they're going to love and they're going to have fun. But maybe in that moment they weren't real excited about doing it. Well, here God is making them rejoice. He's like, man, children, you are going to love this. This is going to be a celebration and worship and praise and joy. He makes them rejoice. This is not a have to, this is a get to. Scripture tells us that creation longs to worship God. All of creation longs to worship God. We get to worship and praise Him. And so here we see this celebration and this worship, this praise of God. One of the places where I see this kind of have to versus get to, I used to be the children's pastor at the church where I serve here at Grace Heartland. And when I was doing children's ministry, you'd see during times of worship with the kids and times of kids worship that you've got the 5th grade boys who are like, oh great, here we go again. I got to sing these songs. And then you've got these kindergartners who are just dancing and singing and celebrating. And it's almost kind of this progression that sometimes takes place in the life of the believer of like initially when we come to Christ, there's excitement and celebration and rejoicing. And as we grow, we kind of seem to sometimes lose that. And it becomes oh, here we go. I have to do this again. This is a get to. We get to praise and worship God. Well, out of their praise of God grows service to God. So service as an act of worship. Verse 44, on that day men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes to gather into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who ministered. So there are people who are being appointed to certain roles, certain acts of service. And then in verse 45, and it says, and they performed the service of their God. Service as worship. Here they are, they're being appointed to do certain things in service and in worship. And then we see them doing that service. They performed the service. What are some ways that you are being called, appointed to serve in the church and to serve in the community? How are you engaging in worship through serving? And this is another place where sometimes we view it as a have to instead of a get to. In fact, for some of you right now, you're kind of at a point where you're looking and saying, well, I've done my time. I have served for a season. I've done my time. It's time for somebody else to step up. As if this is something you had to do for a while and now somebody else needs to do it. Well, it is true that we need everybody to step in and serve, but there's no retirement in God's economy. You haven't done your time and now you get to sit by as other people serve. We continue to serve in different ways and in different roles. How are you being called to serve? And then in verse 47, we see this other act of worship that is often viewed as a have to instead of a get to. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers. And they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. All of Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and the days of Nehemiah gave. Now think about this. These days, the days of Zerubbabel, the days of Nehemiah, are these prosperous days? Like, are they just rolling in money? They just won the lottery and now they can be generous and they can all give. No, these are hard times. It wasn't that long ago in the book of Nehemiah where we saw the people selling their children into slavery because they couldn't afford to feed themselves. Right? This is a difficult season. There's a lot of crisis and strife and chaos, and yet all gave. They all gave. And we don't see any plea for them to give. We don't see any big cry about why they should give or how they need to give. They just simply gave. Back in chapter 10, we saw as a part of this covenant that they were making that they committed to giving in order to make provision for worship in the temple. And here we see them fulfilling that commitment. They all gave. Now that's interesting language because especially today in the church, typically what we see is 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. And that's true in terms of giving oftentimes too. 20% of the people are giving 80% of the towards the ministry of the church. Our church just recently did a giving analysis because one of the things that we've seen recently is that as our numbers in attendance has gone up recently, as we've seen this trend of a growing attendance, our giving is actually going down. Now we realize we're in a difficult time. This is not an easy financial season. Inflation is high. People are have lost jobs. It's just a difficult season. But one of the things that we saw as we looked through this giving analysis that we did, a few things kind of jumped out. One of those is that over the last year, we have seen over 1,000 families as a part of our church. One of the trends that we see now, not just here at our church, but lots of churches around the nation, is that people tend to consider themselves an active member of the church if they are attending once out of every 4 to 6 weeks. Right, so there's not a consistency there. And then, so we're looking at, we've got around 1,000 families that are a part of Grace Heartland in some fashion. And of those 1,000 families, only 425 families gave last year. There are only 425 families. And of the 425 families, 100 of those families gave less than $500 for the year. That's less than $10 a week. Now, here's what I realized. For some of those, that $10 was a stretch. You get a single mom who's working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. That $10 a week is a stretch, and she's giving sacrificially. But for many, that's not much of a stretch for them. And so one of the things that we've discovered is that 98% of our budget is given from just 300 of families. From 30% of the church comes 98% of the giving. And yet here in Nehemiah, what we see is that all gave. All are called to serve and to give, to be a part of contributing to this community and contributing to the ministry that's going on here. What are the ways that you are being called to step up, to serve, and to give as a part of the community of believers that you are a part of, to be a part of what God is doing in that place, the ministry that's happening there, and the way that out of that body of believers, the gospel is being spread. You get to be a part of this as you serve, as you give, as you come together with your church community to praise and worship and celebrate all that God is doing. Well, As we move into our final video next week, we'll dig into chapter 13 where we see that everything begins to go to heck. It's all falling apart. And so we'll dig into that next week as we wrap up this study together. But we really want you to think about this picture here in Nehemiah of the willingness of those who volunteered, who offered to go back to Jerusalem, their willingness to serve. And let that be a challenge to us. Are we willing to lay aside our rights and our desires to serve? And look at how these people are formed and shaped through worship, through praise, through serving, through giving. And it's not a have to, it's a get to. What are the ways that you are engaged in worship through praise and serving and giving? Let's pray. God, we thank you for just the ways that you are forming us and shaping us as your people. God, we ask that as you continue to form us, as you continue to shape us, that you would give us a heart that longs to obey you, a heart that desires to obey and to follow. And God, we do want to just pause to celebrate you and what you have done. God, as we think about in our own lives, the work that you have done in our life to bring us to where we are in our walk with you, God, we celebrate the gift of Jesus Christ, how he died on the cross for us so that we could experience a renewed relationship with you. We celebrate the ways that you have provided for us and cared for us and shown us love and grace and mercy. And God, we worship you, we praise you. You are great and awesome and holy. There is none like you. And so God, we do worship you. We offer to you ourselves as we serve and as we give to your mission and follow you. Pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.